talking about Shakespeare's friends, well, let me start by introducing Kate Pogue's very useful and informative book on the subject. I'm going to start, as she does, with the Quineys. Richard Quiney and William Shakespeare were friends, as were their respective fathers and grandfathers, going back through 3 generations. And into the 4th generation, their children, they were more than friends. They actually married each other.
Quiney wrote the only letter we have relating to Shakespeare, and basically he's asking to borrow money, £30, which would be somewhere in the region of $5,000 in today's money. Also among Quiney's correspondence is a letter from his 11-year-old son written in Latin, which tells us something about the level of culture and education in the Quiney family. Since Quiney's son would have studied, like Shakespeare, at King's New School in Stratford, this is also an indication of the level of classical training that Shakespeare himself, like other grammar school children of that period, would have received.
I won't talk about all of Shakespeare's Stratford friends because, as you can see, there were quite a lot of them. But I'll talk about several of them, and the next one will be a mutual friend of Shakespeare's and Quiney's, Shakespeare's cousin, Thomas Greene.
In 1601, Shakespeare's friend Richard Quiney was embroiled in a legal dispute between the Corporation of Stratford and Sir Edward Greville, the Lord of the Manor of Stratford. He went to London in an attempt to consult with the Attorney General about this matter, and accompanying him was the solicitor and later town clerk of Stratford, Thomas Greene. Thomas Greene is a significant figure in Shakespeare's life. He and his family took lodgings in New Place, Shakespeare's family house in Stratford, certainly from 1609 to 1611, and quite possibly for several years before that. He named 2 of his children, Anne and William, very likely in honour of Shakespeare and his wife Anne Hathaway. And he kept a diary of matters relating to the enclosure of land in Stratford, in which he refers to Shakespeare several times, calling him his cousin. The word cousin was often applied very loosely. It might just imply a distant family relationship, or even merely that they had some kind of ongoing business relationship. But in 1901, Charlotte Carmichael Stopes noted that a Thomas Greene, alias Shakespeare, is recorded in the parish register as having been buried in Stratford on March the 6th, 1590, adding, he was probably the father of Thomas Greene's solicitor, in whose diary and correspondence we find allusions to his cousin Shakespeare, that is, to William Shakespeare. Stopes seems to be assuming something along the following lines: that Shakespeare's grandfather had had a sister who had married a Greene, and whose son had for some reason gone by the mother's maiden name as well as by his father's name, and who was the father of Thomas Greene the solicitor. Rupert Taylor, in an essay published in 1945, comes up with evidence that this is wrong, and suggests that perhaps there was a different, more tenuous and distant connection via another Shakespeare, who may have married a widow by the name of Greene, whose son used both family names. Other scholars, Christopher Whitfield in 1964, and more recently Robert Bierman and Tara Hamling, have looked into this, but no conclusive evidence has so far come up. Maybe Thomas Greene was a blood relation of Shakespeare's? Maybe not. In terms of what I'm trying to do, though, it doesn't really matter. What I'm interested in is exploring Shakespeare's friendships in order to get an insight into what kind of person Shakespeare himself might have been. From that point of view, Greene stands out as being, like Quiney, an educated man. As a lawyer, he must of course have been fluent in Latin, but more than that, he was himself a poet and had strong connections to other literary figures of the period. Greene's study of the law was sponsored by John Marston, an eminent lawyer of the Middle Temple, and later by his son, also called John Marston, who left the law to become a poet and playwright. This makes it not unlikely that William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon knew John Marston, the dramatist, through their mutual friend Thomas Greene. Greene was also the author of a poem dedicated to Michael Drayton, the poet. Again, it seems not unlikely that Shakespeare knew Drayton through Greene, and indeed it is anecdotally recorded in the diary of one John Ward, writing some 50 years after Shakespeare's death, that Shakespeare died of a fever he contracted after a night of merrymaking with Drayton and Ben Jonson, though there's no independent verification of this. So William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon was on close terms both with Richard Quiney, an educated man of some standing who knew Latin and used it in his correspondence, and with Thomas Greene, who was also well versed in Latin, in addition to being a poet with close connections to the literary scene of the time.
The next person I'm going to talk about is Richard Field,
another of Shakespeare's Stratford connections. Field was just 2.5 years older than Shakespeare and grew up in a house on Bridge Street, just a short walk away from the Shakespeare's house in Henley Street. In 1556, Shakespeare's father John sued Richard Field's father, Henry Field, over a debt. And when Henry Field died in 1592, John Shakespeare was one of the appraisers of his property. The two men worked in similar professions, John Shakespeare as a glover and Henry Field as a tanner. In the small and closely knit community of Stratford, the two children inevitably knew each other. The reason I'm particularly interested in Richard Field is that he provides a link between the William Shakespeare who grew up in Stratford-upon-Avon and the William Shakespeare who turned up after a gap of several years in London. Field left Stratford for London, and in 1579, at the age of 17, he began his apprenticeship as a printer. On February the 2nd, 1585, Shakespeare's twin children, Hamnet and Judith, were baptised at the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, and apart from court documents in 1589 naming him along with his parents in a land dispute, that's the last we hear of Shakespeare until September the 20th, 1592, when a work written by another playwright, Robert Greene, supposedly on his deathbed, makes an apparent reference to Shakespeare as an upstart crow. Greene also talks about a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, which is a reference to Henry VI, Part 3, which is generally recognised by scholars these days as a collaboration between Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. So Shakespeare was active on the London theatre scene by 1592. And this is where Shakespeare's childhood neighbour Richard Field comes in. In 1593, Field published the minor epic Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare's first and, during his lifetime, most popular work. The first 4 editions were all printed by Field, who also printed the first edition of 2 other poems by Shakespeare, The Rape of Lucrece in 1594 and The Phoenix and the Turtle in 1601. Field is significant not only because he printed these works by Shakespeare, but because of his close association with a wide range of other works which Shakespeare was indebted to in his own writing. Field was apprenticed to George Bishop, but Bishop farmed him out to Thomas Vautolier, a French printer, and Vautolier subsequently died in 1587, and then 2 years later, in 1589, Field married Vautolier's widow.
or perhaps his daughter, depending on which version of the story we go by.
The books Field inherited from Vautolier, together with the books he himself printed, include the works of Ovid in Latin, Holinshed's Chronicles, Thomas North's translation of Plutarch, Orlando Furioso, translated by John Harrington, Robert Greene's Pandosto, and other works which Shakespeare drew on in his own writing. And there's some debate about whether and to what extent Shakespeare may have accessed these texts directly through Field. He may have done, or he may have read them via another source. What I'm interested in, though, is that a near neighbour of Shakespeare in Stratford, one whose father followed a very closely related profession to that of Shakespeare's father, and someone whom he undoubtedly knew as a child, went on to become one of the top London printers and printed 3 of Shakespeare's own works, along with a number of other works that are also closely connected with Shakespeare. I've talked in some detail about 3 of Shakespeare's Stratford friends, Richard Quiney, Thomas Greene and Richard Field. Just to recap briefly, Quiney was an alderman and the author of the only surviving letter to Shakespeare.
A letter written to him in Latin by his son when he was about 11 years old
also still survives. We know that as an adult, Quiney read numerous works in Latin, and his son, Thomas, married Shakespeare's daughter. Greene, who was a solicitor and town clerk, calls Shakespeare his cousin, and he and his family lived with the Shakespeares for a couple of years or so. His study of the law was sponsored by the poet and playwright John Marston, and he himself wrote a poem dedicated to the poet Michael Drayton. Richard Field, whose childhood home was very close to Shakespeare's, went on to be one of the top London printers and printed the first 3 of Shakespeare's published works, along with a number of works that Shakespeare drew on in his own writings. Other Stratford friends, associates and neighbours of Shakespeare's include Hamnet Sadler, Richard Tyler, Francis Collins, the Combe family, Thomas Russell, William Reynolds, John Hall, Alexander Aspinall, John Robinson, William Walker, Julius Shaw and the Nash family. Not all of them were prominent members of Stratford society or distinguished in any particular way, but quite a few of them were. The Combes were landowners, lawyers and politicians. John Combe was Shakespeare's particular friend, and Shakespeare left his sword to John's nephew Thomas. Thomas Russell, another beneficiary of Shakespeare's will, married Anne Digges, a neighbour of Shakespeare's in London. Anne's son Leonard wrote commendatory verses for the First Folio. The Cambridge-educated physician John Hall married Shakespeare's eldest daughter and was the author of 2 treatises in Latin which were published after his death. And Alexander Aspinall, the Stratford schoolmaster, is believed to have had social ties to Shakespeare. From that little group of Shakespeare's known Stratford friends, we can get a fairly good idea of Shakespeare's social circle in his hometown. It includes doctors, lawyers and politicians, several of whom were fluent in Latin, as well as a major London printer and a couple of minor poets. There are also some significant links between Shakespeare's life in Stratford and his life in London, with Richard Field publishing his early works and Thomas Russell marrying his London neighbour. He may or may not have drawn directly on Field's own books, but he was certainly indebted to a good number of them. And Leonard Digges, who in another context compares Shakespeare to the Spanish poet and playwright Lope de Vega, would of course have known by repute, if not through personal contact, of Shakespeare's Stratford background, as well as his career as a playwright in London. Basically then, Shakespeare's Stratford circle gives us, on the one hand, a pretty good idea of the kind of world Shakespeare grew up in and his place in that world, and on the other some significant links to the world he entered when he went to London and began his career as an actor, poet and playwright.
Thank you for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you're looking for further material relating to Shakespeare and other topics, please visit my Educational Hub website. And don't forget to watch Shakespeare the Man, the companion video to this one.